Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I hope everyone had a good break, and I wanted to welcome everyone back to our closing keynote and the Naveed, Arif, Iqbal keynote lecture. I'm Srijan. I'm the director of the Depression Center here and co-chair of the conference. And as always, this has been a really wonderful conference. Both the formal talks that we've heard throughout the day, but maybe even more than that, the informal conversations that we've had, and being part of them and hearing what's going on and how those conversations have evolved over the many years of the conference has been really wonderful to see, and how the conference has grown, and seeing familiar faces and new ones, and I hope all of you have also had some really thoughtful conversations that you can bring back home and bring some of those ideas back here next year when hopefully everyone comes back. I'm excited to get to our keynote conversation between Jenny Wallace and Rob Ernst. But before that, I wanted to first introduce Arif Iqbal. It's been a few years now in endowing this lecture, and I think it's become a really important part of this conference, a place where we can have conversation about mattering and purpose, and really enhance and bring the conference together. He endowed this lecture in honor of his son Naveed for that purpose, and I think it's really fulfilled that and grown. Arif couldn't be here in person today, but shared a video message that wanted to play and then move on to the conversation. So help me in welcoming Arif.
Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. It is an honor to welcome you to this year's keynote at the Mental Health on College Campuses conference. I created this endowment in memory of my son Naveed, in the hope that his memory might continue by helping young people and deepening the conversation around mental health. For me, that is what this keynote has always been about, not only remembrance, but responsibility. Responsibility to keep learning, responsibility to keep listening, responsibility to keep asking what kind of world we are creating for young people who may be carrying far more than we can see. I've sometimes thought that one of the oldest human gestures is the act of recognizing another person. In many traditions, a greeting was never merely polite. It was an acknowledgement of presence, dignity, and relationship, almost a way of saying, I see you. There's something deeply important in that. Before achievement, before evaluation, before status, before all the pressure to prove oneself in the world, there is a more basic human need: to feel recognized, to feel that one's presence matters, and not to feel invisible. That need is especially important for young adults today who are coming of age in a world shaped so powerfully by comparison, performance, and expectation. Whether in universities, workplaces, or online spaces, many young adults are absorbing the message that their value depends on how they appear, how much they achieve, or how they measure up. But at a deeper level, what every young person needs is something else entirely: to know that their worth is not conditional, that they can be valued and cared for apart from performance, that they matter simply because they are here. Young adulthood can be a time of excitement, growth, and possibility, but we also know it can be a time of pressure, uncertainty, isolation, and quiet pain. Many are doing their best to manage expectations, keep up, fit in, and look fine on the outside, even when that is far from how they feel on the inside. That is why this conversation matters. Mental health is not only about what happens when someone else reaches a point of crisis, it is also about the world we create around one another long before that point. It is about whether the people, institutions, and communities around young adults help reinforce a sense of dignity, connection, and significance. And for those who care for young people, whether as clinicians, educators, parents, or friends, that recognition may be one of the most important forms of care we can offer. That's why I'm especially pleased to welcome Jennifer Wallace this year. Her work speaks to something fundamental not only in the lives of young adults, but in the responsibility all of us share in shaping environments where people feel seen, valued, and able to contribute. I'm also very pleased that today's conversation will be moderated by Dr. Rob Ernst. the University of Michigan's Chief Health Officer. My hope is that this conversation helps us create communities where fewer young people feel invisible and more know deeply and early that they matter. Thank you for being here. And please join me in welcoming Jennifer Wallace in conversation with Dr. Rob Ernst. Thank you.
Ooh, that was moving.
That was really powerful. And I think it really does kind of frame the closing keynote where we'll talk about mattering and flourishing and thriving in college. I'm Rob Ernst. I'm a longtime campus health physician, and I do serve as Chief Health Officer for the University of Michigan. It's a real privilege to be on stage with accomplished journalist and New York Times best-selling author Jennifer Wallace. Jennifer also serves as a special advisor to our health and wellness programming that we do here at the University of Michigan. And she also serves on our advisory council for our Wellbeing Collective. The Wellbeing Collective here at the University of Michigan is our institution-wide place where we address systems and policies to try and, think about the drivers of distress in our community. So thank you for being here today. We only have an hour, so I think we should just jump right in.
Let's do it.
Well, let's start with your first book. In your first book, Never Enough, you were exploring the pressures of many young people that they face today. And that really resonates with many of us, whether it's parents or students and instructors. What led you to investigate and write about emotional well-being of young people?
So first, I'm thrilled to be here. In 2019, I was writing an article for the Washington Post that was covering two national policy reports. One was the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. The other was the National Academies of Sciences. They were looking at who are the young people who are most at risk today for negative health outcomes. They named, as you would imagine, children who have to endure poverty, children with incarcerated parents, children of recent immigrants with few resources, children living in foster care, and then they named a new at-risk group, children attending what the researchers were calling high-achieving schools. These are public and private schools all around the country that are generally well-resourced. These kids were now found to be 2 to 6 times more likely to suffer from clinical levels of anxiety and depression, and 2 to 3 times more likely to suffer from substance abuse disorder than the average American teen. The research was finding something like 1 in 3 young people were at risk, but actually the data now seems to suggest 1 in 2. So these are students and sort of this never enough feeling, which is really what drove the first book.
Well, I was at the opening plenary session yesterday, and the speaker there was talking about 4 timeless conditions that lead to distress in young people: loneliness, anxiety, social comparison or the imposter syndrome, and then uncertainty about the future. And many of us have been, working to bolster mental health resources. Why has the pressure on students reached like this continuing, boiling, simmering point at least?
So in my research for the first book, I spoke with lots of people, anthropologists, sociologists, economists, psychologists. And the story that resonates most with me about why we have reached such a boiling point today is the economic story. So when I was growing up in the 70s and early 80s, life was generally more affordable. Housing, healthcare, higher education was more affordable. There was slack in the system. So parents like mine could be relatively assured that even with some failures and setbacks like a B- in AP calculus I got my senior year, that most likely I'd be able to replicate my own childhood as an adult, if not do even better than my own parents did. That's the American dream, right? Not to just do as well as your parents, but to do even better. But modern parents are facing a different economic reality. We are seeing the first generation, the millennials, who on average are not doing as well as their parents. We have witnessed the crush of the middle class. We've seen the steep inequity that's been ushered in over the last few decades. And it's always been the job of a parent to prepare a child to thrive for the future, in the future when we're no longer around to guide them. But never has that future felt so uncertain. I mean, now we have AI on the scene disrupting everything. We don't even know what we're preparing our kids for. And so what I heard over and over again in my hundreds of conversations with parents, and they didn't say this explicitly, but they were betting big. That early childhood success, getting their kids into the right classes, into the right high schools, into the right college, they hoped would act as a kind of life vest in a sea of economic uncertainty. But what I found in my reporting of what those 2 national policy reports were pointing out is that that life vest is acting too much like a leaded vest and drowning too many of the kids that we're trying to protect, and that there is a better way. This is, just to be clear, this is not to blame parents. One of the reasons I wrote my first book, Never Enough, was because I was tired of this narrative that it's all about the parents, that these helicopter parents have a psychological problem. What modern parents today are facing is a sociological problem. We are sensing fewer and fewer guarantees and safety nets for our kids. And so what intensive parenting is weaving individualized safety nets for each one of our kids. That's research by Melissa Milkey, who is a Canadian researcher. And that is what intensive parenting is. It's trying to create individualized safety nets for each child. It's exhausting for families. It's exhausting for kids.
And kind of exhausting for those of us working downstream in the system when there are these upstream drivers of distress that we're up against. I'm going to reference our friend and colleague, Lindsay Mortensen, because she's always coached me, I should say, to say, connection is protection. It's a very succinct and important message, I think, to try and lean into that human interaction and the importance of that. I'm going to shift and help us understand, or if you can, help us understand the difference between, or the relation between connection and mattering.
So in my research, I went in search of who are the young people today who are thriving, despite the pressures in our environment. What do they have in common? What did their parents focus on at home? How did they experience school, their peer group, the wider community? And it boiled down to this idea of mattering. So mattering is not my idea. It's been studied since the 1980s, originally conceptualized by Morris Rosenberg. And it is the idea of feeling valued for who you are deep at your core, away from your achievements, and having an opportunity to add meaningful value back to the world around you, to your family, your friends, your wider community. So mattering acts like a kind of protective shield. Doesn't mean that young people who feel a high level of mattering don't have distress. They do, but mattering can act like a kind of buoy that lifts them up. So mattering is described by researchers as a meta need, or an umbrella term that captures things like connection, belonging, mastery, self-determination, agency. When it comes to things like belonging, belonging is important, but mattering goes deeper. So you can belong to a classroom or an extracurricular activity or even a family and not feel like you matter to the people in that group. So you can feel like you belong at the table and not feel like you actually matter to the people there.
Yeah, you're really often, and when I've heard you speak or in your writings, you talk about how practical mattering is, and yet we don't often know it when we see it. I surprised one of my friends. Literally, we were walking the neighborhood, and this friends of ours have a teenage child who's been really struggling a lot, and really difficult for the family. And they said, almost apologetically to us, it's like, this is going to sound weird, but she's been working at McDonald's, and it feels like the best thing that has ever happened to her. And we said, well, that's because she matters there. She feels like she matters there. So what does the research tell us about what are the ingredients of mattering? Yeah. Get a little wonky with us about it.
So there are ingredients that researchers have been finding throughout the research, and I put them into a framework just because it's easier for me to remember, that I call SAID, S-A-I-D. And that stands for feeling significant, feeling appreciated, feeling invested in, and feeling dependent on. Do you want me to quickly go through them really fast?
Yes.
Significance. So I was struck in my now hundreds of conversations with people when I would ask them, tell me a time when you felt like you mattered. It was never the big moments. It was never a milestone birthday or an award at work. It was the small moments. It was a colleague checking in after a particularly rough week at work. It was, it was someone saving them a seat at the table. So we crave as humans to matter in the everyday. I think of it as mattering in the mundane. So appreciated, I've come to think of as appreciating the doer behind the deed. So, let's say you have a colleague who is great at community building, who always puts together the happy hours and, makes the group so cohesive. Instead of sending a thank you after a great event, thanks for planning another great event, a way of feeding that person's mattering is to talk about them. Because of you, you are kind of the glue of our department. You do such a good job of bringing us together. We are such a more innovative and cohesive group because of you. Invested in is having people in your life who are invested in your goals and well-being and also being invested in other people's goals and well-being. Researchers describe it as ego extension. So I like to think of it as extending our egos to include the egos of others. And in this way, it is when you invest in someone else's success, you get to appreciate that success. You feel like you win too. And then dependent on is the idea that you have people in your life that you can rely on and that there are people in your life who rely on you, that you are not going through this world alone.
I love that. The SAID framework, I'm going to go through it one more time. Significance, appreciated, invested in, that's the ego extension one,
Yep.
and dependent upon. Good. I like frameworks like that, but I also love your stories. You're a beautiful storyteller. And the stories you tell about real life examples where this shows up is very relatable. And in your book, you early on, talk about firefighters, right? Can you share that today with us?
Yeah. So I actually start the book out. Chapter 1 so I wanted to know, what are the jobs that you just know you matter, right? And I thought, firefighters, of course they know they matter. They risk their lives to save our lives. And then I met a fire chief named Greg, who told me that even firefighters can struggle to see the impact of their work. And that's because, and this I did not know, that firefighters are often the first to arrive at the scene of a car accident or a medical emergency. They stabilize the person, and then EMS takes over, whisks them to the hospital, and they never know what happened next. Did their efforts save a life, ease somebody's suffering? Did that person ever make it? Did they walk again? And so Greg was telling me that it was creating this real disengagement to the work, even cynicism. He said he struggled with cynicism as well as a rookie. And so he created a system when he became fire chief to change that, to track the outcomes of rescues so that when firefighters wanted to know what happened, he'd be able to tell them what their efforts did, how it worked, how that person is doing. And he was able to do that in a way that protected the privacy of the person. And what he found was, gradually the firefighters started taking more pride in their work. They felt more cohesive. Anyway, lots of stories from the firefighters, but that I think is my favorite. And I thought, so many of us, even in our personal lives, often feel so disconnected, right? We offer advice to someone and we wonder what happened. And so what I've come to think about it is what Greg did, which is close the loop. Right? Get in the habit of closing the loop with people, saying to them, remember that advice you gave me? I took it and here's what happened. Thank you for that. Or sending somebody a text. If it weren't for you, ... If it weren't for you and our conversation over coffee, I wouldn't have had the courage to go for that job interview. So really connecting people that we work with, but also connecting the people in our personal lives to their impact.
Yeah, I loved that story because it reminded me of being a primary care doctor and how hard the work is, and yet, having that privileged relationship over years is just really, really rewarding. It feels mutually beneficial. I want to bring it to college campuses. I know you've been working with us some, and you've been working with some other universities around mattering movements in higher education. What are some of the ways that we can lean into this concept to advance the well-being of people who are in our community?
So I am now sort of conceptualizing my next book, which is about a systems approach to mattering. How can we not be reliant on a leader like Greg, the fire chief? How can we create these systems? And so I'm thinking about transition theory, the idea of a student coming onto campus, right, arriving, so moving in, moving through, moving up, and moving on. So how can we, in those critical moments of transition, when our sense of mattering, according to the research, can really be rattled, right? Because mattering is not this thing that we collect and put up on a shelf like a trophy. We matter to specific people in specific situations. So students might come from a campus where they felt like they mattered, and now they're here on this huge campus wondering, who do I matter to anymore? So in that moving in, how can we start to think about how fragile that sense of mattering in, and then moving through and moving up when there's sort of the sophomore slump and other things that we know, trends, how can we sort of how can we build up that mattering, and then moving on, which I actually think Michigan does a fabulous job with their network of, you don't just matter to us as a student, you matter to us for life. So how can we send those messages? I'll give you two things. So I have a son who's a sophomore. I am just now learning the secret sauce of Michigan. And I only know a teeny tiny bit of the secret sauce, but I was struck by this. So he comes onto the campus, and he came from a small all-boys school in Manhattan. So he's here, and there's so many activities, and oh my gosh, I have no idea what to do. He's also not the kind of guy that's gonna go up to somebody at one of the club fairs and ask about it. It's just not his temperament. So Michigan meets people where they are. They created something called Maisie, is that what it's called?
Yeah, it's
this
AI.
AI agent where you can put in your interests and it gives you ideas on what kind of clubs would be best for you. And then you can also make an appointment and talk to people about clubs. I just thought at every step of the way, moving in, we're gonna make this as easy as we can for you. Whether you're an extrovert or an introvert, we're here for you.
If it's okay, I'm going to share that example with the people who created it to let them know how important
to talk
it is
to
for them.
them.
Is that
That's
okay?
amazing.
That'd be a little mattering thing, right?
That's it is. Close the loop.
This morning session was really kind of stuck with me about this anxiety spectrum that goes from sort of anticipation to terror, right? So it's something we encounter a lot in academics here, right? And I love how our provosts and our academic affairs partners are working with us around this tension between academic rigor and well-being. I'm anxious to kind of wrestle more with that. Do you have any thoughts about how we can see our way through this through a lens of mattering?
So I have two thoughts. The first is that when I go around and I speak with parents in high achieving communities, they all say to me, but if my kids know they matter unconditionally, then they're not going to be motivated to keep working. And that's actually not what the research finds and not what I have found just in my own interviews with people. It was the secret to the healthy strivers that I met was that because they felt like they mattered unconditionally, they had the courage to reach for high goals because setbacks and failures were not an indictment of their worth. So mattering is actually the pathway to high achievement. And I think about, and fill in the gaps here if I'm not saying it all right here, but Michigan did a pilot of in a large seminar class, something that I think of as a mattering nudge. So it's a large freshman class. I forget if it was econ or bio. Was it bio?
We call them our foundational courses.
Foundational
so,
courses.
Yeah,
so hundreds of kids.
Some of the folks who've done that work are here today. So kudos, yeah.
Yes, I love this idea and I share it and I hope I'm sharing it faithfully. So at a difficult moment in the semester when it's time for exams and stress is going up, they send a letter to the individual student from the professor. And they have the kids read it in the last few minutes of class. So it has a over 90% return rate or open rate.
Because
or
it comes
success
from
rate.
the faculty member,
because
not
it comes from the
me.
name
Yeah.
of the faculty member, and they ask them a series of short questions. How are you feeling? How's your stress level? Do you want to be connected to mental health resources? Do you want to be connected to a coach, mental health coach? And what they found, and do you remember the data exactly?
Roughly, and it's about 5% or so of the students say, yes, that would be great. And then we help facilitate a coaching session with them. And at the end of the course, even though 5% took us up on the coaching, nearly 100% of the students felt like the university cares enough to ask.
Exactly.
It's a really, amazing kind of intervention. We also asked them, because it comes from the faculty member, the instructor, it's the instructor asking the student if they have any ideas to make the course better too. So that kind of investment is, I think, goes a long way also.
So, and also just to note, the 5% that did ask for the coaching were actually the 5% that were most at risk. They were often first-gen students who maybe didn't have support to go through an exam period. So they really captured the kids that they really, really needed to capture. One of the things, there's a great study, and I wish I could remember the researcher who did it. Maybe it was Gordon Flett in Canada, on award-winning professors. And what was it that made them award-winning? And it boiled down to mattering. It was professors who made the students feel like they cared about them as more than just a student. That's what that mattering nudge does. And also, just to underscore this, I'm sure most people in this room know about the Purdue Gallup Index, the largest study ever done of university students. What is it about a college campus that leads to later life good outcomes, well-being, close connections, career success? And it was 6 key experiences on that college campus. It didn't matter whether it was a big institution, a small institution, prestigious, not prestigious, according to people like U.S. News and World Report anyway, I won't get involved in that because that'll derail me. But anyway, what they found was these 6 key experiences boiled down, they didn't use this word, but it boiled down to mattering. Did the students feel like they had a professor that they mattered to, an activity where they were feeling valued and adding value, the chance through multi-semester projects and internships to use what they were learning in the classroom out into the real world? So mattering really is what leads to lifelong thriving.
I think we're doing fine on time, and we're going to save some time for questions. So if you can think of them, we'll give you that opportunity in a little bit. And I've got another concept I want to get into, but if it's okay, I want to circle back to something and make sure I heard it right. When we were talking about the drivers of distress, you were talking about, and this is something I think that was in your book also, about mental health crisis versus a social health crisis. And in your book, you used an example from the Mayo Clinic that I think was kind of getting into that. Can you tell us about what help sort of make that a little more clear?
So I think we are, as a society, quick to blame is not the right word, but personalize rather than contextualize what someone is going through. And so we call it a mental health crisis, but really if you zoom out, what we are seeing is the result of a decades-long social health crisis. We have pushed humans, and I'm sure everybody in this room would agree with me, to the edges of their capacity to function hyper-individualistically. And so a lot of the distress that we are seeing is really rooted in this breakdown of social connection. There was a study that I love out of the Mayo Clinic. It was a pilot study. It's since been replicated. And it was a busy physicians, medical professionals who were also mothers. And they were reporting low levels of well-being, high levels of stress. Cortisol levels were tested very high. So researchers wanted to conduct a simple intervention. Over the course of 12 weeks, they had the women meet in small groups of 5 or 6 for 1 hour a week to support each other in interdependent relationships, opening up, others opening up to them. It was not a therapy session. It was just feeling seen and heard. Over those 12 weeks, despite the women's busy schedules, not one dropped out. The women reported higher levels of well-being, lower levels of stress. Their cortisol level had dropped. One woman was quoted saying it was shocking and surprising how quickly you could develop these deep connections with people you don't even know. And so what is it about that experiment? I've been thinking about it. What is it about that? One, it was that it was interdependent, that people were willing to be vulnerable with each other. 2, it was the idea of being prioritized. So what these women were struggling with is what I call mattering too much. They were mattering too much to their patients, to the institution, to their own families as caregivers. That's not true mattering. True mattering is about balance, balancing our own needs with the needs of others. And how do we find this balance is by surrounding ourselves with people who remind us of our value and who prioritize us. So a way of one, it is having people who prioritize us in our lives, but it's also, and this is something that it is a new practice for me that I am trying very hard, because I was very much socialized as a caregiver that if my needs were on the list, they'd be at the bottom of the list. I have 3 children, people who are relying on me. And so what I have learned from this research is that our children's resilience rests on our resilience, and our resilience rests on the depth and support of our relationships. So I need to prioritize my relationships. So I literally carve it into my calendar, my time with friends, and I protect it like a doctor's appointment. That's one thing. And then the second thing, which I'll offer, because most of the people here might be like me on the mattering too much part of mattering. And one small practice that I have found to be transformative, and it's really small, but it is to find a way every single day to radically prioritize myself. So while I'm brushing my teeth every day, I think, what is one small need that I need to fill today so that I can show up as my best self to my family and to the people who are relying on me? It might be a 30-minute phone call with my sister. It might be a walk in Central Park, listening to my music. It might be something that I've called grandmothering myself, which is spoiling myself for 45 minutes, sitting with a cozy blanket and a book in the middle of the day, not when all my chores have been done, not when all the words have been written on the page and everybody else's needs, but to radically prioritize my need. It's been helpful.
Well, maybe this related to that, because you started talking about the interconnectedness of people, and I've been really fortunate as a first-generation college kid to have had interested and caring mentors, through my career, and I've heard you talk about the importance of having somebody in your corner. And that's a way to kind of channel mattering. Can you tell us more about that concept of having a corner man?
Yeah. So I came up with this idea because I was interviewing an extraordinary young man named Rayhan Staten, who grew up in Maryland in poverty, had dreams of being a boxer, a martial artist, or martial artist. Yeah, I guess that's what we would call it. But injuries sidelined his career. And so he graduated high school. He went to work at his local sanitation department, and he found real pride in caring for his community and keeping the community clean and healthy. And his colleagues really recognized something in him and listened to his dreams. And he had a dream of going to college. And so they supported him. They did more than support him. They actually insisted that he go and meet with a dean at a local community college, Boise State. And he had bad grades because of poverty. He was falling asleep in class, was hungry, wasn't sleeping at home because it was too cold. Anyway, he goes in, they give him a shot. His cornermen, and he had many in his life, made sure that he had the right shifts that he needed, that he had food, et cetera, in order to succeed. He transfers to the University of Maryland. He then goes on to Harvard Law School. When he arrives at Harvard Law School, I know, an extraordinary story, right? He goes on to Harvard Law School and he starts seeing, he starts recognizing in the staff there something that he felt when he was working in the sanitation department. When he wore his uniform, he felt invisible. And some of the support staff there who were working in the cafeteria or the custodial staff also were exhibiting those signs. And so he recruited his friends to do a letter writing campaign of appreciation. He even started a yearly appreciation ceremony. And what I have found, and he ends the chapter, you'll read about him in the book, he ends the chapter saying, "I see no pride in being a self-made man. That the pride I have is because I had so many people in my corner that if it was up to me, I probably would have stopped and not gone this far, but I could not let my cornermen down." So cornermen, in case you don't know, and I didn't explain, if you know boxing, it's the man in the corner, the one who is there wrapping the fighter's hand, who is encouraging them to keep going, giving them the tough love when they need it. And so, you know, not only do we benefit from having a cornerman in our lives, we also benefit when we become cornermen for others. And that's that practice of ego extension, where someone else's success becomes a part of our success. And I actually say to my kids all the time that at least half of any of the joy I feel on any given day is because I get to relish and delight in the joy of the people that I know, my friends, that I am in their corner, excited, pushing them to finish that book proposal, pushing them to go for the marathon and to be there. So their joy becomes my joy.
I think especially in situations where somebody can move from feeling invisible to then feeling valued,
Yes.
how powerful that is.
Can I just give a really quick, my favorite experiment of all time was, and I'm gonna just tell it really quickly, 2 people at the foot of a hill. Researchers were having them talk about how steep the hill was, alone versus when they were there with someone. And the hill looked less steep when they were with someone than it did when they were alone. Our cornermen, the people in our lives, make life literally less steep for us.
Yeah, it's not more than just looking less steep. It is less steep. It's just, I want to get into this. I think we have time. We've been having so much fun. I forgot there's an audience here. You know, as a primary care doctor, it's easy for me to think one interaction at a time, and yet I do care about a whole community and their health. So how do we think systems-wise on mattering? It seems like it works so well individually. Help us, how do we nudge the environment to foster mattering?
Well, I think it's doing things like, you know, the small things that Michigan is doing, the nudge when you're first there, that we see you as the introvert and we accept you and we meet you where you are, or we see you in this big class. You are not just another number. You are a person that I am addressing on an email, checking in and offering to connect you to support. So it is letting people know, you know, it's going through the SAID framework and thinking, How can we make people feel significant? I'll tell you, there's a school, gosh, and I forget which one it is. It's in Texas, it's a Texas A&M. Somebody was telling me that they have a culture there of howdy, where you pass someone on the campus that you don't even know, and the norm is to say howdy to them. And I think what do we have to do to create these small little norms? Mattering is in the small moments. How can we start these norms, these howdy norms, these check-ins from professors? I'm doing some work with Harvard and bringing Mattering to their campus. And one of the things, and we're co-creating it with students, and one of the things the students we talked about was the idea of chatty tables, which is an idea that comes out of the UK. Where you designate, this is like in cafes in the UK, and it's now worldwide, but tables where people are open to chat. And what's so great about co-creating with young people is that they're like, well, we need to do something so it's not a stigmatized table. So we're gonna say, if you sit at this table, your name will be put into a lottery to win a card to eat at a local restaurant. So there is an incentive. You're not just there because you're lonely. You're there also because you want to maybe win something. So what are these ways that we can co-create with young people to create these mattering nudges, mattering spaces? Think about what are the places, what are the third places besides the classroom, besides the dorm, that young people can go and connect with each other and feel that sense of belonging and mattering.
Before we open up for questions, I hope it's okay. In your book, you attribute a quote to your father where you say, when you're fully present, you don't really feel a need to go back. How is it that college students can manifest that perspective in college?
I think one of the things we could do with freshmen, and I know there are schools that are already doing this, but to almost formalize, think about yourself 5 years from now, 10 years from now. What is the story you want to tell about your time at college? And then ask yourself how you can help to tell that story. So helping kids really invest in their future selves by making specific decisions now, and then maybe saving that piece of paper and revisiting it as a senior and having them write a letter to an incoming freshman. Here were my hopes, here's what worked, here's what I wish I'd known, my first steps. So really creating this kind of cycle of awareness and recognition and reflection.
It's in the toolbox of our friend Ethan Cross about, thinking about our future self. I'd like to open it up to any questions. I promise we haven't spoiled the book in any way. If you haven't read it yet, we've touched on it here and there, but there's so much more in there. If there are questions, I'd invite you to come to the microphones and let us know who you are, where you're from,
or if you have ideas. While we're waiting for people to get their thoughts together, I would love to hear from anybody who is working on things that could be considered a mattering nudge. I'm hoping to collect lots and lots of nuggets for my next book, or just to share your work and your research on what you're doing. So reach out to me on my website, jenniferbwallace.com. I'd love to hear from you.
Joy. Yeah.
Hi. Joy Pelkey, I met you earlier this morning. Thank you so much. This is such a great conversation. Something I've been thinking a lot about is ego extension. I don't know if people watch skateboarding and snowboarding in the Olympics, but that's an example. If you watch the athletes, you almost can't tell whether they won or their friends won, because it's such a powerful, you can feel like how that works. But I think about that as like the opposite of the hyper-individualism in a high-achieving culture. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on, that's a systems change too, is like, how do we actually integrate that cheering for others, which goes beyond the howdy norm, which I love that too. But what are your thoughts on that?
So I love that you asked this. So I devoted a whole chapter on this idea in my first book, Never Enough. Because what gets in the way of ego extension in a very competitive culture? Envy. particularly among high-achieving students. Envy, it bubbled up, right? When you are around a group of people who have a very narrow definition of success, you're going to feel envy. And so what I say to young people, and I think we can start norming this, is that all of us feel envy. We all evolved to feel it for healthy adaptive reasons, right? For our earliest ancestors, envy meant something that somebody had that we thought was critical for our survival. And so we evolved to feel those pangs, those painful pangs. We don't have to judge ourselves, but we have to hold ourselves accountable for how we act on that envy. So when those feelings bubble up, we can take 2 routes, maybe even 3 routes. The first route is the malicious envy route, which is cutting somebody down so we look better by comparison. There's the benign envy route, which is using that source of envy as a source of inspiration. How'd you do that? I'd love to do it too. Or we could take the third route, which is the mudita route, which is I am so impressed by what you did. What are you looking to do next? How can I invest in you? So that we can reap that reward. So I think it starts with norming the feelings, making that thinking visible and norming it and giving people the skills, the coping skills.
That is a really great cultural kind of thing. That was the guy from Michigan, wasn't he? When he lost, he was interviewed and said, "I have never had so much fun losing in my entire life."
Well, that's it. And the athletes, watching athletes, seeing them racing each other and swimming against each other and being so competitive, and then the next second hugging each other.
Yeah.
Right? We're capable as humans to do that.
Mark? Yeah.
Hey, thank you so much, Jennifer. I'm just really curious if you have any thoughts about faculty. I mean, it just struck me when you were saying the dilemma that parents face, trying to support their children to achieve. I mean, faculty in some ways are in a similar role. We're trying to help our students achieve. I think, I'm a faculty member, and of course, I received no mental health training whatsoever. In my own educational development, my mental health was not a subject of discussion. It was all about leaping these hurdles to show my achievement. But what I think of as a teacher has really transformed over the course of my career. And I want to create a base, that sort of solid base that students can extend themselves from. But I think that whole question of how faculty relates to students is so vexed, because we want to be close and supportive, but not abusive or interfering. But I wonder how you might characterize that relationship of faculty on a college campus in a way we might think about the learning environment as a place to give students the confidence and the support they need to really be fabulous.
Yeah, I think, I will say, I think it's never been harder to be an educator than it is today. I think we are asking educators to solve some huge global problems that we can't seem to solve as a society, but we're expecting them to be solved in university campuses and classrooms. So one, just to recognize how hard the job is now to educate young people, and 2, to give faculty resources, training modules. Before we even do that, though, I think back to the Mayo Clinic research, and it has also been replicated by educators, by heads of schools, male educators. Our young people's resilience, student resilience, really rests on the resilience of the adults in their lives. And so we need to, I think, as a culture, really support educator well-being and support systems and prioritize that. There's a great quote in my book by an educator saying that, I'm going to botch it, but essentially you're creating the learning conditions, so you need to be supported. So I would say that's the first step. Just like it is true for any, when there's a child in distress, the number one intervention is to make sure the caregiver's resilience is intact. And so I would say that's where we start. We start by really bolstering the resilience of educators, and then resourcing them. And also, this is a longer conversation, but I would say support system for the educators first, so that they could be that source of support for young people.
Put in a plug for the project we did in partnership with the Center for Academic Innovation, where we're trying to do vignettes of helping educators navigate students in distress, and actually acknowledging that in those situations, that's one of the situations we've learned, just as you've shared, Mark, is one of the higher levels of anxiety-provoking situations for being in that role. So that's how our Wellbeing Collective is kind of working in partnership, to try and address that very important issue.
Faculty are first responders.
Yeah.
And we need to train them like first responders, and we need to support them like first responders need to be supported.
Hi, my name is Navya. I'm a third-year medical student here at the University of Michigan. Thank you both for being here and sharing your conversation. I wanted to go back to the study or intervention that you mentioned for the group of women who were meeting for about 12 weeks and how that impacted their mattering. Even though they were so busy, they were able to show up, be vulnerable. On our medical student council, I'm working with a couple of my peers to do something similar for second-year medical students who have just entered the hospital space after learning for a year and face so many different challenges, from isolation to the emotional difficulties of being in medicine. And I think from the outside, it may not seem obvious that medical students struggle with mattering in these environments. And so I was really wondering, in terms of these conversations that, or group meetings, what do you think was so effective for that intervention that might be able to be replicated for other populations?
So I think thank you for that question. I think the first thing was that the conversations were scaffolded with a topic. So the women didn't have to come up with a topic in small talk. So maybe it was, the pile-on of stress, or being, in the sandwich generation. So something that they're all going through. It could be perfectionism and versus striving for excellence. So a topic every week, prioritizing it at a specific time and day so that it could be carved out. It's since been replicated virtually and found to be just as effective. That happened before COVID. And it's also effective for men. So I think it's the priority, it's putting it in the calendar, it is having the agreement of everyone there that it's confidential, and that everyone is a willing participant, so no one is just sitting back. Everyone is participating, and the scaffolding of a topic.
And bravo for putting in that intervention at a time of transition. We heard about transitions earlier, and you didn't say it at the time, but I know you talk about this in your book also, about transitions being not just logistical times, they're emotional fault lines. So it really is our obligation to think about those times from a systems perspective and coming up with things like that. So bravo.
Thank you both.
Amazing.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk today. I had a question kind of similar to the one that was asked previously, but how you see staff support in this work of mattering. I work in a really cool office within the School of Social Work. It's actually called the Flourish Office. So we work with students, staff, and faculty, literally cross roles and connecting them so that these kind of moments can happen. But the hardest thing that we have, like the hardest group that we have with supporting, is the staff, because there's so many resources for students, and there's really great resources for faculty. We have CLRT, we have so many trainings available for them. But when it comes to staff, like, it's really hard to be like, yeah, make sure everyone else knows that they matter, but you're replaceable. So like, how can we flip that narrative from like that perspective to make sure that our student, specifically our student-facing staff, know how they're so important to our students' lives, even if they don't have that doctorate, even if they're not teaching, or the ones paying to keep the lights on? Like, how can we help the staff members?
I think it's creating opportunities for social support and normalizing it. If you feel like you have staff that maybe wouldn't be as comfortable talking about emotions and perfectionism, here's a little thing that has been found to be so effective in my own personal life. You could have meetings around a specific article in the news or in a medical journal and meet to talk about that topic. So what I have found is scaffolding really matters. Scaffolding could be food, It could be an article that you're gathering, but people are loath to just go into a group without some sort of reason for being there. So I would start thinking about how could you create these groups on a weekly basis? And if logistically it's hard to get people in the same room, having these small groups virtually. I participated. It's a group called Authentic Connections. I don't know if they're doing them anymore because the founder passed away, but you can go and Google up, they have resources, so you can create your own Authentic Connections groups. I also think that that's maybe not the best name, so maybe thinking about a cooler branding. I used to say this to the founder, who was a very dear friend. She was like, why is this not catching on? I said, the name. You need a better brand. Authentic Connections. No one wants to join that. You need to think of like a better brand. So like some topic.
Although I will say, I think the Flourish office is a good brand.
Yeah.
It seems like the opposite of like where I grew up, which was the emergency room. You know, that's kind of like, I think we have time for one more question. It's a good.
Hi, I'm Amy. This is more of a curiosity. As a former educator, I taught first grade for over 21 years, and I get to continue educating through mindfulness education, and I facilitate sleep-based guided rest called NSDR and Yoga Nidra. And I'm curious, in your research about mattering, excuse me, have you come across anything, or are there any insights or connections that you're able to share about mattering to and for yourself first and foremost? I found in my work with small children, and I still do find this today, I work with all ages, is that fostering a sense of connection within the self into sort of your higher self or purpose is key. So I was curious about that. I'd like to know more.
So I recently co-authored a paper with the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. I'm trying to remember the title of the paper, but if you go to the Harvard Center on the Developing Child website and you look up it's a working paper there, and just Google up mattering and you'll find it. But about how mattering develops, right? It develops in the earliest of ages with the primary caregiver, with the attachment figure. And then it develops in adolescence, you know, as adolescents are developing a healthy sense of self. How are others seeing me? How do I matter to the world around me? So it matters throughout the lifespan, mattering. It starts from the earliest of ages. And you know, Gregory Elliott is a mattering researcher at Brown, and he has this phrase, which we did not put in the paper because it sounds a little fatalist, but it's not. It's what goes in early, what gets in early gets in deep, is his phrasing. Doesn't mean it can't be repaired. But for me, I think it is such I know for a lot of the people that I have interviewed who did not get that sense of mattering from their parents or felt a contingent sense of mattering, that knowing that that's where it comes from and that's how they can go back to repair that is so important. But we do have to learn how to matter to ourselves, particularly if we never had that in childhood.
Thank you so much.
Well, I have got to wrap this up. I've got 3 things. First, I'd like everyone to join me in thanking Jennifer Wallace for being here.
Guys.
Next, I'd like to thank you all for being here, not just for this session at the end, but for actually being here for the conference, the conference, Mental Health on College Campuses. And third, I'd like to thank you all for the work that you do supporting the health and well-being of our campuses, the students, and the broader university community. So I think my friend Lindsay's going to close the session. Thanks, Jen.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you so much, Jenny and Rob, for that conversation. So much of what you shared resonates with me both as a practitioner and as a parent of a soon-to-be college freshman. I also just want to thank you guys for the great questions and engagement. Actually, the question about medical students in particular reminded me of the unique vulnerability of people and trainees who work in helping professions. And I'm looking at one of the preeminent researchers into some of the risk that medical trainees face. And it occurred to me as we've been chatting that there is this phase of training where there's this unique vulnerability where I think mattering can feel quite low while you're grinding and studying alone and watching a lot of difficult things unfold. And you don't always have a role to play. I think of, veterinarians, social workers, therapists, many of you are in these roles. So lots to think about that I'm going to be taking away from the conference today, and so many connections across many, many conversations. Before we end today, just want to share a couple quick reminders. One is to look out for an email later today with a link to evaluations and attendance confirmations for those of you seeking CEU credits. Even if you aren't claiming CEUs, we would love to hear your feedback about your experiences in the various sessions. We always look at those, we always debrief, and it informs planning for next year. Speaking of which, next year, our conference, March 23rd and 24th, is our 25th annual conference. And this is really, really special and reflects the legacy and work of some people who are not in this room and some who are. Those who have come to the conference before know we started 25 years ago as the Depression on College Campuses Conference, and this conference and mental health stigma and the work of universities has evolved so much in such a short period of time. I think sometimes in higher ed, it feels like things are evolving at a glacial pace. But really, for some of us, I'm a Gen Xer, to think about the pace of change, even from when I was a college student, really gives me hope. And I just really appreciate all of you being here and helping us to co-evolve this work together. I hope you also travel home today with new perspectives, new tools, new ideas of what success looks like for you and on your campuses. And most of all, leave feeling hopeful. Thank you for closing this keynote out with us, for contributing all of your experiences and thoughts, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you next spring, and safe travels. And thanks again to Jenny and Rob. Thanks.